June 1945, southern Okinawa. Rainwater dripped from the lip of a limestone cave in slow, patient beats, as if the island itself had become a clock, counting down the end of an empire. The mud outside was black and slick with ash. The air smelled of wet coral, unwashed uniforms, cordite, and something else now, something almost indecent in that landscape of rot and iron. It was sweet. One of the cans had been split with a bayonet and bent back along its seam. Inside, under a film of syrup that caught the weak cave light, were yellow rings of pineapple. For men who had lived on shrinking rice portions, jungle roots, rotten stores, and fantasies of final victory, the sight was more unsettling than artillery. A can of fruit bright as sunlight had found its way across an ocean, through fleets, bombs, storms, and submarines, and had arrived here at the very edge of Japan's last defensive shield. In that moment, the war no longer looked like banners, emperors, vows, or maps. It looked like a steel tin in a starving man's hand. That moment mattered because Okinawa was not merely another island battle. It was the gate before the home islands, the last great barricade between American power and the Japanese mainland. By the spring of 1945, more than 1,600 ships and 350,000 naval personnel had assembled for the operation, and when U.S. forces landed on April 1st, they brought with them not just rifles, tanks, and flamethrowers, but the whole industrial weight of a continental state. The battle would drag into June and cost the Americans more than 49,000 casualties, including over 12,000 dead. About 90,000 Japanese combatants died, while Okinawan civilian deaths may have reached 150,000. Okinawa was a military contest, but it was also a revelation. One side still spoke the language of sacred endurance, while the other arrived with such depth of supply that even the battlefield could carry echoes of a supermarket, a cannery, a refrigerated warehouse, a railroad timetable, and a voting public that expected its sons to be fed as well as armed. For years, Japanese soldiers had been taught what kind of enemy America would be: soft, materialistic, spoiled by comfort, a nation of quantity rather than spirit. The logic seemed simple enough. A people accustomed to abundance would collapse when abundance disappeared. Men who loved pleasure would not endure attrition. Soldiers nourished by convenience would not survive jungle filth, malaria, thirst, and caves. But such ideas were not trivial. They were central to how the war had been imagined. The United States could build more ships, perhaps, but surely morale built on comfort would be brittle. Surely a nation of consumers could not outlast a nation of believers. The Pacific was supposed to prove that steel could be broken by will. Yet by 1945, on islands from New Guinea to Okinawa, that theory had curdled in the hands of the men ordered to live inside it. What they actually experienced was the opposite. American abundance did not disappear at the front. It arrived there. U.S. forces fielded multiple ration systems, A, B, C, D, and K, designed for different conditions, from garrison life to fast-moving assault. Fresh foods, canned foods, accessory packets, cigarettes, can openers, sugar, coffee, and preserved meals were built into military planning, not as luxuries, but as routine expectations. Even when American troops complained about monotony, the monotony itself was a kind of wealth. It meant the supply system was functioning. A soldier might curse canned meat and beans, but he could curse them because they kept arriving. Japanese soldiers on collapsing island outposts were often confronting a civilization that had learned how to put calories, salt, sweetness, and metal packaging into a system as disciplined as artillery fire. The pineapple can, then, was more than fruit. It was a symbol with an empire behind it. Hawaii had become the center of the modern canned pineapple industry. By 1930, it led the world in canned pineapple production, and by 1940, Hawaii was described as producing 80% of the world's pineapple pack. That mattered in war because it meant the sweetness inside that tin was not exotic chance. It was industrial agriculture, shipping, canning technology, chemistry, labor organization, port infrastructure, and scale. Pineapple had traveled from plantation rows to mechanical peelers, from cannery belts to stacked cases, from depots to troop ships, and from troop ships to a cave where a starving enemy stared at it as if looking through a hole torn in propaganda. The can said something brutal without speaking. A country rich enough to make fruit this ordinary for its common soldiers might be too large to exhaust. By late war, hunger had become one of the most decisive weapons in the Pacific, and often it was turned most savagely against Japanese troops by their own broken logistics. Professor Yoshida Yutaka's work on the battlefield experience of Japanese soldiers shows that of roughly 2.3 million Japanese military fatalities in the Asia-Pacific War, about 1.4 million, some 60%, died away from direct combat, largely from starvation and disease. In parts of the South Pacific, daily caloric intake could fall to around 1,700 calories, far below the roughly 3,200 needed for active service. Men already weakened by carrying loads approaching 50 kilograms staggered through mud and fever into a world where supply lines vanished, medical support failed, and disease finished what bullets had begun. The myth of heroic death remained, but the body told a different story. It was not always the enemy's fire that defeated the imperial soldier. Very often it was logistics or the absence of logistics, or gnawing quietly through muscle, judgment, and faith. In that sense, the pineapple can on Okinawa was not a random curiosity. It was the visible edge of a much larger collapse. By 1945, American mining and blockade operations were choking Japan's shipping arteries. Operation Starvation, begun in March 1945, laid more than 12,000 mines, sank or damaged roughly 670 ships, totaling about 1.25 million tons, and cut shipping through the Shimonoseki Strait by around 90%. Food and raw materials that the empire needed to sustain both factories and civilians were strangled at sea. The consequences reached far beyond the home islands. Every isolated garrison, every hungry cave, every desperate foraging patrol in the Pacific was connected to that maritime suffocation. The men opening enemy tins were not simply tasting American food. They were tasting the outcome of a logistical war already being lost on docks, sea lanes, and harbor entrances hundreds of miles away. And still, doctrine demanded endurance. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent decades sanctifying refusal. A 1908 penal code held that a commander who allowed his unit to surrender without fighting to the last man could be punished by death. A revised military law in 1942 still prescribed severe penalties. Soldiers absorbed the principle so completely that many later said surrender was absolutely unrecognizable, or that Japanese don't surrender. That fear was intensified by propaganda insisting that Americans mutilated, tortured, and humiliated prisoners. Men were told not only that capture was disgraceful, but that it would drag shame onto parents, siblings, wives, and children. So the battlefield became a theater of dreadful expectations. If hunger did not kill them first, surrender would destroy them spiritually, and the enemy would destroy them physically. That is why the emotional contrast was so violent when reality broke through. Japanese soldiers expected barbarians. Many encountered medics, interpreters, cigarettes, bandages, water, and food. Allied psychological warfare eventually replaced blunt, "I surrender" leaflets with the far more careful phrase, "I cease resistance," because even the word surrender could repel men trained to prefer death. Those passes promised treatment in accordance with international law, and for some of the starving, sick, and abandoned, the leaflet became not only a scrap of paper, but a bridge between two incompatible worlds. The world they had been taught to fear, and the world they finally saw. There had been signs of this before Okinawa. On Makin Atoll in 1943, a captured Japanese diary recorded the psychology of a trapped soldier with remarkable clarity. At first, he and his comrades spoke the language of ritual death. "We know we are going to die," he wrote, and their thoughts turned again and again towards suicide, noble finish, and the beautiful end. But then came a startling entry from November 26th. "Today, we filled ourselves up for the first time on chocolate, beef, sugar, and bread, which was left by the enemy." It is one of the most revealing lines in the Pacific War, not because it describes a feast. By American standards, it was ordinary field food, but because it shows a starving soldier crossing, for one instant, from ideology into metabolism. He did not eat an abstraction. He ate evidence. Now imagine that same revelation 2 years later, but sweeter. Not bread this time, not beef, pineapple. Syrup glistening on the lip of the can. The flesh of a tropical fruit, processed by the enemy in quantities vast enough to survive transport, handling, battle, and waste, and still be available to the infantrymen. To a hungry Japanese soldier on Okinawa, the shock was not merely that Americans had pineapple, it was that they had enough pineapple to lose pineapple, to abandon pineapple, to issue pineapple so widely that it could appear in the ruins of a battlefield as if the war itself could not interrupt the American supply habit. Hunger sharpens not only appetite, but intellect. A starving man sees systems through crumbs. He understands that abundance is not measured by what a nation produces in peace, but by what it can still distribute in war. That sweetness also carried another, quieter message. In authoritarian states, luxury often travels upward. It belongs to officers, party elites, ministers, the inner circle. But the American ration system, for all its imperfections, embodied something different. Mass distribution, not elegance, not refinement, access. The can in an enlisted man's hand meant that ordinary soldiers were expected to receive what factories could make. Even children encountered that reality. Photographs from Okinawa show U.S. servicemen offering K-rations to Okinawan children in the aftermath of fighting. The symbolism is hard to miss. One system had spent years teaching civilians and soldiers alike to fear capture, conceal weakness, and die properly. The other, brutal and destructive as all invading armies are, I'd also arrived with an industrial habit of feeding bodies first. The pineapple can became a small democratic object, standardized, sealed, unromantic, and available to the common man. This did not make the Americans gentle, and it did not make the war clean. Okinawa remained a slaughterhouse of caves, artillery, flame, and shattered civilian life. Kamikaze attacks sank 36 ships and damaged 368 more. Ridges like Kakuzu and Sugarloaf became meat grinders. Civilians were trapped between armies, driven into tombs and caves, sometimes coerced by Japanese soldiers, sometimes killed in crossfire, often starving in fear. There is no honest documentary voice that can turn the Battle of Okinawa into a morality play of pure benefactors and pure villains. But the moral force of the pineapple can lies precisely in that harsh setting. It did not appear in a peaceful marketplace. It appeared amid one of the war's worst infernos. Its sweetness did not erase violence. It exposed the difference between how power was organized on each side. For many Japanese prisoners, the shock of capture became a shock of identity. Alison Gilmore's research on Japanese prisoners in the Southwest Pacific found that around 19,500 were taken there alone, with numbers rising sharply in 1944 and 1945. Once captured, many prisoners concluded that the terror stories of American torture had been false propaganda. Some described themselves as effectively dead to their former lives. One lieutenant explained that almost all Japanese prisoners of war have the idea of new life and rebirth, adding that having died as a Japanese soldier, all we prisoners of war have been reborn. The phrase is astonishing because it turns imperial logic inside out. The state had taught that capture ended honorable existence. Yet some captives used that symbolic death not to disappear, but to think anew. Rebirth began not with speeches, but with experiences. Food, medical treatment, safety from execution, the sheer fact of not being mutilated. One can imagine the mental sequence in a cave on Okinawa. First, the body reacts. Sugar, saliva, trembling hands, the sharp ache of a starving stomach waking too quickly. Then the mind resists. A trap, poison, deception. Then the senses insist on their own authority. The fruit is real. The syrup is real. The metal is real. The enemy clearly has more where this came from, and the enemy has somehow managed to carry this sweetness to the end of the world, while your own army cannot carry rice. After that comes the most dangerous recognition of all. Not that America is rich, but that richness itself has strategic meaning. This is what empires fear when they begin to fail. Not only losing battles, but losing explanatory power. A can of pineapple may say more to a starving private than 1,000 slogans from Tokyo radio. The Japanese war effort had asked its soldiers to believe that spirit could compensate for material inferiority. On some battlefields for some time, Ferocity did impose terrible costs on Allied forces, but by the final year of the war, Spirit had become trapped inside an increasingly fraudulent promise. Men were ordered to perform transcendence while their bodies collapsed from preventable hunger. They were told that surrender was disgrace, while commanders lost the practical means to sustain continued resistance. They were instructed that Americans were decadent, while Americans demonstrated logistical stamina on a scale so vast, it made decadence and discipline seem, in practice, almost the same thing. If a government can guarantee cigarettes, canned food, can openers, medical evacuation, and relentless naval support to men thousands of miles from home, then softness begins to look suspiciously like institutional competence. There was a cruel irony here. Pineapple is a tropical fruit. It belonged, in the imagination of empire, to warm colonies, plantations, shipping lanes, and expansion across the Pacific. Imperial Japan had tried to build its own sphere of command over the tropics, to master the islands, the ports, the sea roads, the resources. But in the cave on Okinawa, the tropical fruit came sealed in an American can. Not Japanese, not local, American. The empire that had claimed destiny in Asia was staring at the commercial afterlife of another nation's farms and factories. The fruit had become geopolitical evidence. Whoever controlled production, shipping, processing, and ordinary distribution controlled not only supply but imagination. The pineapple ring was a map of victory curled inside itself, and because this was Okinawa, the meaning went even deeper. Okinawa sat close enough to Japan to terrify the home islands with proximity. If American fleets could stand here, if American ships could continue to arrive here under kamikaze attack, if American soldiers could fight here for nearly 3 months and still feed themselves, then what awaited Kyushu and Honshu would be beyond anything the rhetoric of final battle could conceal. Hunger often speaks ahead of strategy. Long before formal surrender documents were signed in Tokyo Bay, men at the edges of the empire were already receiving the verdict in rations and empty depots, in disease, in drowned transports, and in enemy food so plentiful that it could seem wasteful. The war was ending, not only because bombs fell or fronts collapsed, but because the imperial promise no longer matched the inventory. Perhaps that is why food recurs so often in war memory. Men forget dates and retain flavors. They forget the names of ridges and remember the first cup of hot coffee after bombardment, the first spoonful of rice after capture, the orange, the biscuit, the cigarette, the peach, the soup. Food enters memory because it enters the body. It turns history intimate. The pineapple can on Okinawa was not a cabinet document or a staff map. It was history in digestible form. Sweetness under steel. Industry converted into sensation. Defeat translated into taste. And once tasted, it could not be untasted. A man might still fight. He might still die. But some part of him had already crossed a line from faith into knowledge. There is another reason the can mattered. It was sealed. That seal represented trust in systems beyond sight. Workers who packed it, inspectors who checked it, quartermasters as the slogans said it was. So the image remains. A cave, rain dripping, the distant concussion of naval guns, a starving soldier with syrup on his fingers. He had been told that victory would belong to purity, austerity, sacrifice, and the noble will to perish. Yet what lay in his hand was the opposite theology. Mass production, preservation, transport, distribution, and a sweetness so unnecessary to bare survival that it suggested a nation fighting with reserves of energy far beyond mere necessity. The pineapple was not powerful because it was luxurious. It was powerful because it was ordinary. Any empire can stage grandeur. Few can make abundance feel routine in the middle of apocalypse. And that is the larger truth toward which this moment points. Freedom is not only the right to speak, to vote, or to worship without fear. In the modern age, it is also the creation of systems sturdy enough that ordinary people do not vanish into hunger the moment history turns violent. Abundance, at its best, is not greed. It is resilience made shareable. The can of pineapple on Okinawa carried within it the quiet architecture of a freer society. Farms not stripped solely for a ruler's glory, factories not operating only for prestige, ships not sailing merely to sustain a myth, but a vast, imperfect machine capable of placing food into countless anonymous hands. In the who counted it, sailors who hauled it, by officers who requisitioned it, and voters back home who expected the machinery of the republic to function. Democracy is often imagined in speeches, ballots, and constitutions. Yet in total war, democracy also appears in mundane competence, in whether the ordinary private is fed, equipped, rotated, and remembered. The pineapple can was not democracy in a pure form. No wartime state is pure. But it was one expression of a society whose immense productive power was not reserved only for a court or caste. The enlisted man ate from it. The child could be handed some. Even the enemy might open it. That mattered. On the Japanese side, transformation often came too late to save a life, but not too late to alter a worldview. Some prisoners helped Allied propagandists. Some urged others to cease resistance. While some concluded that the real betrayal had not been capture but deception, being told to die in purity while supply systems rotted and promises thinned into ritual. When prisoners said they had been reborn, the phrase carried more than relief. It carried judgment. It meant that the ideological self forged by the military state had died before the physical self did. What remained was a human being rediscovering simpler truths. Hunger hurts, fear lies, kindness disorients, sweetness is real. And governments should be measured not only by the deaths they demand, but by the lives they can sustain. Even for those who never surrendered, the revelation could still happen in fragments. A captured crate, a discarded ration, a rumor that the enemy had ice cream barges while your own unit boiled weeds, a leaflet promising food and medical care, or a glimpse of American ships so numerous they seemed to crowd the horizon itself, a child chewing on a K-ration biscuit, a dead Marine with better boots than your officer. Wars end unevenly in the human mind. Flags may still wave while belief is already gone. Empires often die this way, not in one cataclysmic instant, but in 1,000 private recognitions that the world is no longer arranged. And many Japanese soldiers understood the war was over, not when they heard a speech, but when they touched that machine in miniature. Long after the guns fell silent, the sound of the lid being peeled back would remain more eloquent than rhetoric. The thin metallic crack, then the soft release of syrup, then the impossible smell of fruit in a place built for death. It was the sound of illusion giving way, the sound of a starving empire meeting a fed republic, the sound of doctrine losing an argument to reality. And in that cave, with the rain outside and the sweetness inside, the war announced its ending in the language the body never mistakes.